All right, let's shift. Thank you, Magnus. To Ulrika Danielsson from AP2 or Andra AP-fonden. And Ulrika, we have worked, our organizations have worked together for, I think it's nearly 10 years. So we know, of course, about the work that you do internally with regards to D&I. But you're going to tell us about what you do externally when you invest. So welcome, and please, go ahead.
Thank you. I'll see if I can share my slides. There. Can you see them? Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mitli, for having me on this seminar and for being able to talk about this very important topic. Just some short facts about AP2, because I guess most of you are not familiar about us. We are one of the 5 buffer funds within the Swedish pension systems, and we manage more or less every asset class all over the world. And we have approximately 400 billion Swedish crowns under management. And we are 67 persons working here at our office in Gothenburg. The AP funds are required by law to manage our assets in an exemplary manner through responsible investments and responsible ownership. But it's not because sustainability is in the laws that we work with sustainability. Sustainability is in our DNA and has been so for more or less since we started in 2001. Within sustainability, our work is mainly concentrated to 4 focus areas where we consider to be most important and where we have expertise and experience. And these are climate, corporate governance, human rights, and diversity. And diversity, and particularly increasing the proportion of women on boards and in management positions, was one of the first corporate governance issues that we started with to work with. And for 20 years now, since 2003, we have measured the proportion of women in executive management teams and on the boards of Swedish listed companies. And we yearly publish a report of this female representation index. And the aim with the index is to spread knowledge, contribute to a dialogue and a debate, and above all, of course, increase the proportion of women on boards and in management teams. We think that with greater diversity in background and experience, the right conditions and leadership, teams become more innovative and creative. This in return produces more successful companies. And information from the index we use in our corporate governance work, and we follow up when we attend general meetings. And as you can see here, the index for 2022 show that the proportion of women on boards and in executive management teams is the highest ever now. The proportion of women board members continues to increase and is now 35.4%. And the proportion of women in executive management teams also continues to increase and is now 27.2%. Despite the increase of proportion of female board members, the number of female shares is only 30 out of 356 companies, and the number of women CEOs is only 43. When we look at nomination committees with women, we can see that this has a positive correlation with boards with a higher proportion of women. And boards without nomination committees have a lower proportion of female board members than other companies. Here at AP2, we have both women and men representing in nomination committees, and we have the same positive development regardless to gender. The proportion of newly elected women on Swedish companies' boards where AP2 did serve during 2021 was 67%. And as I said, though we started to measure the proportion of women in 2003, it took years before we had integrated diversity within our investment decisions. And I will mention some examples of how we integrate. We manage our assets, for example, global equities, according to an index. And an index contains a large number of companies traded on the market, and we allocate our portfolio according to an index, and the performance of our portfolio is also measured against the index. At AP2, we have created our own index to be able to have ESG factors in the index. And exposure to various ESG factors such as equality and the proportion of women in the company is included in the index structure. There are indications that as a factor and from a global perspective, the proportion of women in the company has contributed to a positive return on the fund's indices for global equities. And just now we have an ongoing process of reviewing the ESG factors used in the index, partly with the aim of evaluating diversity from more perspectives than we have done before. For example, to see if we can include the ratio between the total number of women and the number of women in executive positions, a metrics that provides an indication of a company's capacity to retain talent within the organization. Diversity is also a priority issue when we invest in private equity. The fund's model for analysis and evaluation of private equity companies' sustainability practices includes diversity and inclusion. In the dialogue that we have with the private equity managers, we raise questions such as what is the status of diversity in the company among employees and management? Does the company have policies and guidelines in place, and how are they embedded within the organizations? What are the company's goals in terms of diversity and inclusion? And the aim with these questions, of course, is to drive change. And when it comes to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, at least twice a year, we conduct a review of the fund's listed portfolio based on the impact of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. All companies identified in this review with a high risk of negative impact of any of the global goals will be addressed. For diversity, equity, and inclusion, Goal 5, gender equality, and Goal 10, reduced inequalities, have been identified as most relevant and will be followed up when we have dialogue with the companies. We have dialogue with companies that in this review are misaligned or strongly misaligned with the goals. Voting. When it comes to voting, we vote against boards with no representation of gender. And for a gender. And for our global holdings, we vote against members of the nomination committees if the level of gender diversity on boards is below 30%. And just recently, during October, we sent out a letter to our Swedish holdings that have less than 30% gender diversity on the boards and asked them to really step up on this issue. Going forward then, during this year, we have broadened the focus area diversity to also include equity and inclusion. And we have put a long-term goal, what we shall achieve within this focus areas to 2025. And we have yearly goals, for example, to include a dialogue with companies with lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And last but not least, we support Mittliv. Each year, under Mittliv's mentoring program, 5 of our employees have the opportunity to serve as mentors. And Mittliv also educate all employees on diversity and inclusion issues. Thank you so much.
Well, Thank you, and thank you for mentioning Mitt Liv as well. Ulrika, you said something brief, it was just brief, but I think it was the most important point perhaps of those 10 minutes. When you have incorporated the, let's call it the gender factor in your index, you said it has contributed positively with regards to return. Could you say something, just a little bit more about that?
Well, it's a bit too early to say yet, but we could see a positive correlation on the positive return, and it's stronger on developed markets than in emerging markets. But when it comes to be able to measure what has led to, when it comes to dialogue and voting, it's hard to measure the performance of those actions. But as a starting point, we think it contributes to positively to our return. That is a starting point for us.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ulrika.